A proud Texan, forced into a marriage the town believes will ruin him. But she's the only thing standing between him and utter ruin. As drought gnaws at the Texas land, enemies surround them from all sides, and the town awaits their downfall. Clay Mercer and Evelyn Cross must prove that true power never looks what it seems. This is the story of a marriage orchestrated to destroy them, but which instead built an empire. Like and comment the city you're watching to let me know how far this story has come. The offer came on a Tuesday, which Clay Mercer would later think was a strange day for a man's life to fall apart. He was sitting across a polished oak table from Harlan Dodd and Preston Whitmore, two men who dressed like they'd never worked a day in the sun and who smiled the way rattlesnakes coiled before striking. Dodd had silver hair swept back under a good hat. Whitmore had the kind of soft hands that came from spending other people's money. Between them on the table sat a stack of papers, and at the top of that stack was Clay's name, followed by a number that made his stomach clench every time he looked at it. $14,200. That was what the Mercer Ranch owed. Not to a bank. Banks had declined him 8 months ago. The debt was to Dodd and Whitmore, who had bought it from those banks at a discount and now held it like a weapon. "Clay," Dodd said, folding his hands together as though he were about to say grace, "we are reasonable men." "You've said that 3 times in the last 10 minutes, Clay replied. "Reasonable men don't usually need to say it more than once." Whitmore let out a short laugh. He was the younger of the two, maybe 40, with pale blue eyes that never quite settled. "We're offering you a way out, a clean slate, 14,000 wiped from the books, deed to your land returned free and clear, and a 5-year lease on the eastern water rights you've been trying to get since your father died." Clay said nothing. He looked at the papers. Outside the window of Dodd's Clearwater office, the main street sat baking under a July sun that hadn't softened in 6 weeks. The creek beds were cracking. The feedlots on the eastern edge of town had shut down for lack of water. 3 neighboring ranches had already sold off their cattle at panic prices, and 2 more were expected to follow before September. Texas was burning from the inside out, and Clay Mercer was burning with it. "What's the condition?" he said. Not a question. Dodd smiled. "You marry Evelyn Cross." The room held still. Clay heard a wagon pass outside, a dog barking somewhere down the street. He made himself keep his face flat and his hands loose on the table. "Evelyn Cross," he repeated. "Marcus Cross's daughter. His niece, technically. She inherited his estate when he passed last winter, property in Dallas, holdings in Abilene, a house here in Clearwater that sat empty since March." Dodd paused, letting each detail land. "And a great deal of money." "She's also—" Whitmore started. "I know what she is," Clay said. He'd seen Evelyn Cross twice in his life. Once at her uncle's funeral in March, where she'd stood at the graveside in a dark dress, solid and still, while the preacher talked too long and the wind came up from the south. She was a heavy woman, not just broad, but genuinely large. With a round face and dark hair she kept pinned back without fuss. She hadn't cried at the funeral, which some people found cold, and which Clay had privately found to be her own business. The second time was at the general store in April, where he'd held the door for her and she'd thanked him without meeting his eyes and carried her own parcels without asking for help. He had formed no strong opinion of her either way, but he knew what Dodd and Whitmore were doing. Everyone in Clearwater knew what Evelyn Cross looked like. Everyone in Clearwater had opinions about what Evelyn Cross looked like. She had come to town with money and without pretense, and the town had decided immediately that she was to be pitied at best, mocked when convenient. A woman like that, people said. What kind of life could a woman like that really expect? Dodd and Whitmore were betting that a Clay Mercer married to Evelyn Cross would be a Clay Mercer no serious man in Texas would do business with again. "You want to ruin me," Clay said, keeping his voice even. "That's what this is." "We want to see the debt settled," Dodd said, opening his hands wide. "How you interpret our generosity is up to you." "The water rights and the deed," you said. "In writing, signed the morning after the ceremony." Clay looked at the papers for a long time. He thought about his father, who had worked this land for 31 years and died owing less than $1,000. He thought about the 60 acres of winter grass on the south slope that hadn't been grazed yet because he couldn't afford to move cattle that far without water. He thought about the 4 ranch hands who were still showing up every morning, even though he'd paid them late 3 months running. He thought about what it meant to lose the land altogether, the auction, the dispersal. Everything his father built sold off in parcels to men like the two sitting across from him right now. "I need to speak with her first," Clay said. Dodd blinked. That wasn't the response he'd expected. "Speak with Evelyn Cross. I'm not agreeing to marry a woman without talking to her first. If she's willing, and if she understands what she's agreeing to, then we can talk terms." He pushed back his chair and stood. "Set up a meeting." The meeting happened 3 days later, at the Cross property on the north edge of town. A square, solid house with a covered porch and a yard that needed work, but showed signs of someone who intended to get to it eventually. There were seedlings on the porch railing in clay pots. A pair of work gloves on the step. Clay knocked. Evelyn Cross opened the door herself. She was wearing a plain gray dress and no jewelry except a thin watch on her left wrist. She looked at him directly, which some women didn't bother to do with men they didn't know, and her expression was neither welcoming nor hostile, simply attentive. "Mr. Mercer," she said. "Miss Cross, thank you for agreeing to see me. Come in." She stepped aside. "I made coffee. I assumed you'd want some." The inside of the house was organized the way a person organized things when they had a specific place in mind for everything. Books on shelves sorted by subject, a desk near the window with papers arranged in flat stacks, a large map of the county pinned to the wall beside the fireplace, with notations in pencil along the margins, elevation marks, water source locations, property lines. Clay noticed the map before he sat down. "You've been studying the county," he said. "I've been here since March," she said, setting 2 cups on the table. She sat across from him with the same economy of movement she'd shown at the door. Nothing wasted. "I try to understand a place before I make decisions about it." "Dodd and Whitmore came to you with this arrangement?" "They sent a letter," she said. "Very formal. I'm to understand the offer was framed as a business proposition. I provide the debt relief, you provide the respectability of a husband. We both benefit from the arrangement." She wrapped both hands around her cup. They didn't use the word respectability, but that was what they meant. "Did they tell you what they were expecting to get out of it?" "They didn't need to." She looked at him levelly. "Mr. Mercer, I have spent my adult life in rooms where people assumed I was either desperate or stupid. I am neither. I know exactly what Harlan Dodd thinks is going to happen to your reputation if you marry a woman who looks like me. I also know he's wrong." Clay was quiet for a moment. "Why are you considering it then?" She set down her cup. "Because I am 34 years old, I am new to this county, and I have more money than I know what to do with in one place. I have ideas about land and water and cattle that no one in Clearwater will take seriously from a woman on her own. And I have been watching the drought, and I believe the next 2 years are going to separate the ranchers who are paying attention from the ones who aren't." She paused. "I need someone who actually owns land and is willing to let me help manage it." "And you think I'd let you?" "I think you're a man who is out of options," she said without cruelty. "That makes you more likely to listen than most." It was the most honest thing anyone had said to Clay in 6 months. He almost laughed. "What would you need from me?" he asked. "A fair hearing on business decisions, credit for the ideas that work, and the understanding that if I am going to invest my inheritance in your land, I expect to be treated as a partner, not a decoration." "And personally?" She considered this. Courtesy, privacy, and no pretending. She met his eyes. "I'm not asking for romance, Mr. Mercer. I am asking for honesty. If we cannot manage that between us, the rest of it doesn't matter." Clay drank his coffee. It was strong and slightly bitter and exactly what he needed. "I'll be honest with you right now, Miss Cross," he said. "I don't know whether your ideas will work. I don't know you well enough to know if you're as sharp as you seem, and I'm not entirely comfortable with any of this." "Good," she said. "Neither am I. That means we're both being realistic." He nodded slowly. "All right." Mats. The wedding took place on a Friday morning in early August with a county judge, 2 witnesses, and a ceremony that lasted 11 minutes. Evelyn wore a blue dress that fit her well and carried no flowers. Clay wore his cleanest shirt and felt like a man who had made a decision he didn't fully understand yet, which was not entirely different from how he'd felt on other significant occasions in his life. They signed the papers. Dodd and Whitmore signed the papers on their end the following morning, and by Saturday afternoon the deed to Mercer Ranch was returned, the water rights transferred, and the debt reduced to zero on paper. The town of Clearwater knew about it by Saturday evening. Clay would not have predicted the speed with which news traveled in a drought. People had little else to think about except the sky and each other, and the marriage of Clay Mercer to Evelyn Cross was the most remarkable thing to happen in 3 months. He heard it in fragments over the next few days, at the feed store, at the water trough outside the livery, carried back to him by his ranch hand Tomas, who had the particular gift of absorbing conversation without appearing to. "They're saying she bought you," Tomas told him one morning, not unkindly. He was Mexican-born, 26, and had worked the Mercer Ranch for 4 years without missing a day. He spoke the way he did everything, straight, without decoration. "That you sold yourself for the debt." "People aren't wrong about the structure of it," Clay said. "They're also saying other things. About her." Tomas looked at the horizon, the way a man did when he had something harder to say. "Not kind things." "I know." "And you're all right?" Clay thought about the map on the wall of the Cross house, the pencil notations, the 2 stacks of papers on the desk, neat and purposeful. "Ask me in 6 months," he said. Evelyn moved into the ranch house the following Monday, arriving with 2 trunks, a wooden crate of books, and her own set of cookware, which she said wasn't a commentary on Clay's kitchen, but a preference for particular pots she'd been using for years. She took the larger bedroom by prior agreement and hung the county map, an updated version, larger, with more notations, on the wall where the previous owner's gun rack had been. She spent the first 3 days walking the property. Not with Clay, not with Tomas, not with any of the hands. Alone, from early morning until late afternoon, with a leather notebook and her watch and boots that were already broken in. She walked the fence lines. She walked the dry creek bed that ran along the property's eastern edge. She walked the south slope with its ungrazed grass and the ridge above it, where the wind came down cold from the north in winter. She walked to the neighboring property lines and stood looking across at land that was already showing stress, thin cattle, overworked ground, the particular exhausted look of a ranch that had been managed the same way for too long. Clay watched her from a distance the first day and felt a complicated mixture of pride and unease that he couldn't quite separate. The second evening, she came in from the east fence, sat down at the kitchen table, and spread her notebook open without preamble. "Tell me about the Dunbar grazing lease." Clay sat across from her. "It expired in June. Dunbar wanted to renew, but I couldn't pay for it." "What's the price?" $40 a season. "And the acreage?" 260, northern section. Good grass, or it was before the drought. They've got a secondary well up there that feeds from the limestone shelf, usually reliable even in dry years. "Has it gone dry this summer?" "Not when I checked in May." Evelyn wrote something in the notebook. "I want to approach Dunbar about a different arrangement. Instead of a lease payment, we offer labor, one of our hands 2 days a week for maintenance and fence work in exchange for grazing access and shared water rights." Clay thought about it. Dunbar's old, getting older. His son moved to Houston, which means he has land and not enough help. She looked up. "It costs us less and gives him something he actually needs. That's a better negotiation." Clay was quiet for a moment. "That's not a bad idea?" "It's a very good idea," she said, without arrogance but without false modesty either. "I have several others." He found, somewhat to his surprise, that he believed her. The first Sunday after the wedding, Clay drove the wagon into Clearwater for supplies. He had told Evelyn he was going alone, and she had agreed without complaint, and he had not entirely examined why he'd suggested it. It was possible he was protecting her from whatever awaited them in town. It was possible he was protecting himself from watching that happen. He got as far as the main street before he understood it didn't matter. "Morning, Clay." The hardware store owner, Bill Pruitt, said it straight enough but couldn't hold the look in his eyes entirely level. "Settling in all right?" "Fine, Bill. I need rope and 2 hinges." Sure. Pruitt moved to the back shelf. "Heard about the wedding. Quite a thing." People tend to get married. It's not usually remarkable. Well, the circumstances. Pruitt set the rope on the counter. Dodd's not a man you want to owe things to. I understand that. A man does what he has to. I need a box of nails, too. Common. 6 penny. Pruitt got them. He seemed to want to say something else, but the look on Clay's face discouraged further observation, and the transaction was completed in relative silence. Outside, loading the wagon, Clay heard 2 women talking at the corner and caught the words clearly, though they didn't try to lower their voices particularly. She's enormous. Emma showed me from the upstairs window when they drove through. And then a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, and wasn't quite anything else. He finished loading the wagon and drove home. That evening, he told Evelyn what Pruitt had said, the parts worth telling, because he'd decided in the wagon on the way back that honesty required not editing the town's reaction into something softer than it was. Evelyn listened. She was working through a column of figures at the kitchen table. Are you bothered by it? She asked when he finished. It bothers me that they said it, he said. Whether it bothers me what they said is a different question. She looked up. Does it? He thought about this with the same careful honesty he tried to bring to other questions. Not the way they intend it to, he said finally. You look the way you look. I'm not troubled by that. I'm troubled by the fact that they think they can use it. They can try, she said, and went back to her figures. It was, Clay thought later, the most confident thing he'd ever heard said in a quiet voice. The drought tightened through August. 2 more ranches in the county sold off cattle below cost. A family named Gerhardt, who had worked a small spread on the county's western edge for 15 years, put up a sale notice in August and were gone by September, loading a wagon before dawn one morning without saying goodbye to anyone. Their land sat empty afterward with a particular silence that Clay found hard to look at. Meanwhile, strange things began happening on Mercer Ranch. Not dramatic things. Not the kind of changes a man would necessarily notice unless he was paying close attention. Evelyn had walked every inch of the property and come back with a list, and the list became a series of small adjustments that individually seemed minor and collectively were beginning to shift how the whole operation functioned. She reorganized the cattle rotation, moving the main herd off the south slope 3 weeks earlier than Clay had planned, and letting that section rest while rotating through 2 smaller pastures with shorter intervals. Overgrazing this late in the drought will kill the grassroot systems, she had explained, standing at the kitchen table with her map and a pencil. We'll lose 3 years of recovery time. Shorter rotations on these sections preserve more biomass. I've been ranging cattle since I was 12, Clay had said. I know. But you've been doing it in the same drought for 3 months, and you're doing it the way your father did it, which worked when there was more water. This isn't the same situation. It had been a hard thing to hear. He'd been quiet for most of a day afterward, which Evelyn let him have without comment. And then he'd looked at the south slope with fresh eyes and realized she was not wrong. She also began conversations with suppliers that Clay had given up on. The feed merchant in Haskin, who had cut the Mercers off in July over an unpaid invoice, received a visit from Evelyn on a Wednesday morning while Clay was mending fence on the east side. She arrived, paid the invoice in full from her own account, negotiated a new credit arrangement with a written contract that protected both parties, and came home in the wagon at noon, having also secured a lower rate per ton for fall delivery, contingent on a minimum purchase amount that Evelyn had already calculated they could meet. How did you get a lower rate? Clay asked. He was trying not to sound too surprised. I pointed out that they've lost 4 accounts this summer to drought closures, and that we intend to stay in business. A reliable customer in a drought is worth more than their face value. She hung up her coat. He also appreciated that I paid the old invoice without arguing about it. It established good faith. Clay looked at her. You knew I was going to ask how. I know you find it strange when things work, she said, and there was something almost dry in her tone that might have been humor. He found himself almost smiling. He wasn't entirely sure what to do with that. Tomas was the first of the hands to adjust. The other 3, older men, longtime Mercer employees named Harris, Pete, and a quiet man called Grover, who no one had ever heard use more than 6 consecutive words, took longer, which Clay had expected. They were not men who distrusted women so much as men who distrusted change, and Evelyn represented both simultaneously. Tomas adjusted because Tomas was 26 and had been raised by a mother who ran her household's accounts, and a grandmother who had organized a water-sharing cooperative among 7 families during a dry summer when Tomas was 8. He recognized competence in the way a person recognizes a familiar landscape. "She's figured out the North Water Table," he told Clay one afternoon, tacking up a horse at the barn. "Been asking me about where the ground stays damp longest after a rain. I showed her the low section by the old property corner, you know, the one with the dark soil, and she dug a test hole and measured it. Says there might be enough moisture there to support a secondary dig. A well." She said not necessarily. She said something about subsurface collection. I didn't follow all of it. Tomas finished the tacking and turned around. "But she's right that it stays wetter longer there. I noticed that years ago." "You never mentioned it to me." Tomas shrugged, not unkindly. "You never asked me where the ground was wet, Mr. Mercer. She did." Clay thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. At the end of August, Dodd and Whitmore appeared in Clearwater with 2 men from a cattle consortium out of Abilene, and the group was spotted having dinner at the hotel restaurant and drinking afterward at the saloon, which people noticed because Dodd and Whitmore didn't usually spend money on hotel dinners when they had office space to meet in. Clay heard about it from Bill Pruitt, who had apparently decided, now that he felt guilty about the rope and nails conversation, to position himself as a source of useful information. "They were talking about the Mercer water rights," Pruitt said, in a low voice that he probably thought was subtle. "Eastern section. Word is Dodd thinks the arrangement he made wasn't, well, that he gave you too much." "He signed the papers," Clay said. "I know he did. I'm just saying what people are saying." Pruitt looked uncomfortable. "Word is also that those men from Abilene have money and they're interested in acquiring land. Consolidating, they call it." "They can be interested in whatever they want," Clay said. "Signed papers are signed papers." But he told Evelyn that evening, sitting at the kitchen table after supper with the lamp turned up and the window dark. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. She was looking at the map on the wall, which now had so many notations that portions of it were more pencil than paper. "Dodd knows he made a mistake," she said. "He expected us to fail fast. We haven't failed fast. We've been married 5 weeks. In a drought," she said. "Most operations are already in decline. We're not." She turned to look at him. "That's the part that's bothering him." "What do you think he'll do?" She considered this the same way she considered most things, without rushing to an answer. "He'll start with pressure," she said finally. "Social, financial. He'll try to squeeze us from the supply side and the reputation side simultaneously, because separately, neither works fast enough. He needs to make us look like a failure before we can prove otherwise. And if we start looking like we might actually succeed." Her expression didn't change, but something in her eyes did. "Then he'll stop playing carefully," she said. "And that's when it gets harder." Clay looked at the map, at the county spread out on the wall in pencil and paper, with Evelyn's neat handwriting marking water sources and elevation shifts and the property lines of their neighbors, including the Dunbar land to the north, where they had now negotiated grazing access, and the empty Gerhardt spread to the west, which had gone quiet since the family left. He thought about his father, who had managed this land for 31 years without once asking for help, and without once fully asking for help, and without once thinking to look at the ground to see where it stayed wet the longest. He thought about what it cost a man to be wrong, and what it cost a man to keep being wrong because he couldn't stand to admit it. "What's the next move, Jules?" he asked. Evelyn looked at the map for another moment and then back at him. "We move faster," she said, "before he does." They were not a romantic couple. They had not pretended otherwise. Clay slept in his room, Evelyn in hers, and the household ran with a businesslike efficiency that would have seemed cold to someone looking at it from outside, but didn't feel cold from inside. It felt, in its particular way, like a kind of respect. They ate meals together and talked about the ranch and about the county and occasionally about other things. Evelyn had grown up partly in Dallas and partly in East Texas and had opinions about both. Clay had lived in Clearwater his entire life except for 2 years in his 20s that he didn't volunteer information about, and Evelyn didn't ask. What they had, increasingly, was a working partnership that neither had fully expected to function. One evening at the end of August, Evelyn came in from the barn. She had started helping with evening feeding, which had surprised Harris so thoroughly that he'd dropped a bucket with a thin scratch on her forearm from a fence wire. Clay was at the table. He saw the scratch, got up, found the tin of salve his mother had kept, and which he'd kept after her, and handed it to her without a word. She looked at it for a moment, then she looked at him. "Thank you," she said. "It'll scar if you don't keep it clean," he said. "Wire scratches always do." She opened the tin and applied it herself methodically, and set it on the table between them when she finished. "Clay," she said, which was the first time she'd used his first name without prompting. He looked up. "I think we can do this," she said. "The ranch. I think we actually can." He looked at her for a moment, at the round face, the dark hair coming loose from its pins after a long day, the scratch on her forearm, the steady way she held his gaze. "I'm starting to think so too," he said. It was not a grand declaration. It was not a moment from a story. It was two people sitting at a kitchen table in a drought, with a map covered in pencil marks on the wall and enemies they hadn't dealt with yet, and a future that was anything but certain, agreeing, quietly, that they had something worth fighting for. Outside, the Texas sky held no rain. The earth was cracked and the creek beds were dry, and Harlan Dodd was somewhere in Clearwater making plans. But Mercer Ranch was still standing. For now, that was enough. September arrived without rain and without mercy, and Harlan Dodd moved exactly the way Evelyn had predicted, from two directions at once. The first sign came on a Monday morning when Tomas rode in from the north fence line with a look Clay had learned to read over 4 years of working together. Not panic, something quieter and more specific than panic. "East section," Tomas said, stepping down from the saddle. "Someone cut the wire." Clay was at the barn door. He didn't say anything for a moment. "How many breaks?" "4, maybe 5. Hard to tell until we walk the full line. And 3 steers are out. I saw them grazing on the Dunbar side of the boundary." Clay pulled his hat on and went to get his horse. They spent most of that morning repairing wire and rounding up cattle that had wandered through the gaps overnight. The cuts were clean, not the frayed accidental break of old wire giving way, but deliberate, made with a tool, spaced at intervals that suggested someone who understood which breaks would cause the most movement. Clay looked at each cut and didn't say what he was thinking. When they got back in the early afternoon, Evelyn was standing on the porch with her notebook. "I need you to tell me if this is the first time this has happened," she said. "Wire breaks?" "Deliberate ones." He looked at her. "Yes." She wrote something down. "I want Tomas to start keeping a log. Date, location, what was damaged, what condition the break is in, every incident, no matter how small." "You think there'll be more?" "I think we should be ready to show a pattern," she said. "If this goes anywhere legal, we'll need documentation that this was sustained and intentional, not a series of accidents." She paused. "Also, we need to check on the cattle in the south pasture before dark. I want to do a count." There were 7 missing from the south pasture when they counted. Not strayed. The fence on that section was intact. Cattle didn't disappear through solid fencing. Clay stood at the gate in the late afternoon light and felt a cold anger that had nothing dramatic about it. It was the kind of anger that settled low and didn't make noise. "How much are 7 steers worth right now?" he said. "At current prices, assuming they were mid-grade stock, somewhere between $240 and $280, Evelyn said beside him. She was looking at the pasture without expression. "Which they knew. They took enough to hurt, but not enough to be obviously catastrophic. A message, not a finishing blow." "Not yet." "Not yet," she agreed. "But the supply problems began the following week, and they arrived wrapped in polite language that was harder to argue with than outright refusal. The feed merchant in Haskins sent a letter, very formal, addressed to Clay, expressing regret that due to, and here the letter used a phrase that Evelyn read twice and then set down on the table with a particular flatness, current contractual obligations to larger accounts, the agreed fall delivery would need to be reduced by 60%. No explanation of which larger accounts. No offer of a renegotiation date. Clay read the letter and looked at Evelyn. "That's Dodd's money talking," she said. "He's bought priority with whoever's supplying Haskin. Can we go around it? Find another supplier? I already sent letters to 2 others in September. I got a response from Marlin last week declining without explanation. She paused, and Dodd was in Marlin the week before that letter came. The pattern was becoming clear in the way an unpleasant truth becomes clear, not all at once, but in accumulating pieces that you couldn't pretend not to see. Dodd was methodically tightening the supply chain around them, using money and relationships built over years to quietly signal to every merchant and vendor in the region that doing business with the Mercers carried a cost. It was elegant, in a vicious way. Nothing that could be proven. Nothing that left a signature. Just a slow tightening that was designed to look like bad luck. He's done this before, Clay said. Almost certainly. To who? Evelyn looked at him steadily. The Gerhardt family sold in August and were gone before sunrise. Before that, the Pell brothers sold in June. And there were two others in the past 3 years that I found in county records when I was going through Marcus's papers. Marcus kept notes about local land transfers. She let that sit for a moment. Dodd buys the debt, then manufactures the conditions that make repayment impossible. We're not the first. Clay sat with that. Outside the kitchen window, the September sky was the same dry blue it had been for weeks, hard and cloudless, with the particular brightness that beautiful weather gets when it's becoming a problem. What do we do about the feed? He said. I've been thinking about that. Evelyn opened her notebook. There's a cooperative out of Waco, smaller operation, not in Dodd's usual territory. Longer haul, costs more per ton on delivery, but they're not connected to his supplier network. If we order now and pay half up front, we can likely get October delivery. She looked up. It'll eat into the operating reserve. How much will we have left? Enough for 2 months if nothing else breaks. Less if we keep losing cattle. The silence that followed had weight. Do it, Clay said. Evelyn wrote the order that evening and sent it the next morning. She did not say that it might not work, and Clay did not say it either, because they were both the kind of people who understood that naming a risk too many times doesn't reduce it. It just makes the room smaller. The rumors started in early October, and they spread the way rumors spread in small towns that don't have enough water or conversation, fast, sideways, and with embellishment that outpaced the original. The version Clay heard first, relayed by Pruitt at the hardware store with genuine discomfort, was that the Mercer cattle had been showing disease symptoms and that Clay was trying to sell sick stock into the regional market. The version he heard second, from the liveryman's wife who told him directly and seemed to think she was doing him a favor, was that Evelyn had brought debts from Dallas that weren't disclosed before the marriage, and that Mercer Ranch was about to be foreclosed on from a second direction. Neither was true. Both were specific enough to sound credible. The third rumor was the one that actually mattered, because it was targeted at the people Clay needed. The smaller ranchers in the county who had been quietly watching the Mercers and forming opinions. The rumor, which seemed to originate from Dodd's circle and reach Clay through Tomas, who had heard it from a hand at the Willard Ranch, was that Clay Mercer had been seen in Abilene meeting with the same land consortium that Dodd represented, and that the marriage to Evelyn Cross was a setup to acquire her inheritance before selling off the combined property to outside buyers. That one had teeth, because it was the kind of betrayal that a small community could not forgive, and it was designed to cut off exactly the relationships Evelyn had been quietly building with neighboring operations. We need to move on the Dunbar arrangement, Evelyn said the evening Clay told her about the third rumor. Make it public and formal. If people see a signed cooperation agreement between us and Dunbar, it's harder to believe we're planning to sell. Dunbar's agreeable to making it formal? I think so. I've been over there 3 times in the last month. His fence on the northwest section is in poor condition, and Tomas has been helping him repair it. Dunbar's not a man who forgets when someone helps him. She was quiet for a moment. He's also not a man who likes Harlan Dodd. His daughter sold him a parcel 3 years ago under circumstances that weren't entirely fair. Clay looked at her. You knew that before you suggested the labor arrangement with him. She met his eyes without apology. I knew it was useful to have a neighbor who had reason to trust us more than he trusted the alternative. He was quiet for a moment. Not upset exactly, more recalibrating something in his understanding of her. She wasn't naive. He'd known that. But the layering of it, the way she saw not just 1 step forward, but 3. That was something he was still measuring. All right, he said. We talked to Dunbar. But Harris quit on a Thursday. He came to Clay in the morning, hat in hand, and said he was sorry, but that he had an offer from the Willard Ranch for more pay and steadier situation, and he couldn't turn it down with a family to think about. He was a man in his late 40s who had worked for Clay's father before he'd worked for Clay, and he had the particular discomfort of a person who is doing something that they know is partly wrong and are choosing anyway. Clay shook his hand. He said he understood. He meant it, mostly. After Harris left, Clay stood in the barn for a while. 3 hands now. Tomas, Pete, who was 53 and reliable but slowing down, and Grover, who was quiet and efficient and hadn't said anything about leaving. Clay ran the numbers in his head, the same numbers Evelyn would probably run better on paper, and they did not add up comfortably. He found Evelyn at the north fence, walking it on her own, which she'd been doing more often. She had taken to wearing trousers for field work, which Clearwater had opinions about, and which Evelyn demonstrated she had no interest in those opinions by continuing to wear them. "Harris is gone," Clay said. "I heard his wagon." She kept walking. "Pete and Grover? Still here?" "Good." She stopped at a section of fencing that had been repaired twice. "I want to add wire here. They've been targeting this section specifically. The repair pattern is too regular. Someone's testing whether we check this side consistently." Clay looked at the fence. She was right. "You've been mapping the break locations. That's what the log is for." She turned to look at him. The September wind came across the flat land and moved a strand of hair across her face, and she pushed it back without fuss. "Clay, I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it without getting proud about it." He braced himself in the way a man braces when someone says that. "All right. We need to hire, not just replace Harris. We need 2 more hands at minimum if we're going to run the operation I'm planning for spring. And I know the reserve is thin." She held his gaze. "I want to use money from Marcus's estate, my money, to cover the payroll gap through winter. It's not a loan, it's an investment in a shared asset." The pride she'd warned him about moved through him exactly as expected. It was a real feeling, and he knew exactly what it was, and what it cost him to do the right thing about it. "I don't like it," he said. "Miss, I know." "But you're right." The words came out flat and honest. "We can't run what needs running short 3 people." She nodded once, without ceremony. "I'll put out word in Clearwater tomorrow." "People in Clearwater might not want to work for us right now." "I'm not hiring from Clearwater," she said. "I'm hiring from the Tejano Quarter on the county's south edge. There are good workers there who don't get hired by ranches like Dodd's because Dodd's foreman doesn't think they should be." She said it without righteousness, just information. "They'll work hard because they need the work, and we'll pay fairly because that's how you build loyalty." Clay thought about Tomas, who had showed up every morning for 4 years without once being late. "You think this through before you say things," he said. "I think everything through before I say it," she said. "It's why I don't talk very much." They stood at the fence for a moment in the thin October light, with the dry land running out flat in every direction and the problems stacked up around them like freight, and Clay found, somewhat against expectation, that he was less afraid than he'd been in August. It was Grover who said it. Grover, who in 4 years of employment had communicated primarily through nods and direction of gaze, said it one evening at the end of October while he and Clay were putting tools away after a long fence repair day. "She's saving this place," Grover said without preamble. Clay looked over. Grover was hanging up a post hole digger with the same expression he brought to everything, which was not much. "Yeah," Clay said. "I'm staying," Grover added. Clay nodded. "Appreciate that." "Didn't say it for appreciation." Grover picked up his jacket. "Said it because it's true." He went out, and Clay stood in the barn alone for a moment, and outside the Texas sky was doing what it had been doing for months, holding its water, offering nothing, watching to see what the people below it were made of. Evelyn had proposed the gamble the previous evening. The full plan, the one she'd been building towards since August, since the county map and the pencil notations and the water table calculations. Clay had listened to all of it. He hadn't said yes yet. He wasn't ready. What she was describing was not a safe move. It was the opposite of safe. It was everything on one throw. And the part of him that had watched Harris drive away and counted feed invoices at 3 in the morning and repaired the same fence section 4 times in 6 weeks wanted badly to say no. But he also knew, with the clear and uncomfortable knowledge of a man who had spent 2 months watching someone be right, that Evelyn Cross had looked at the same broken, drought-pressed situation he'd been looking at for years, and she had seen something in it that he hadn't. He turned off the barn lamp and walked to the house. The kitchen light was on. Through the window he could see Evelyn at the table, the map spread in front of her, her pencil moving. He went inside. "Tell me the plan again," he said. She looked up. She didn't look triumphant. She looked like someone who understood exactly what they were asking. "From the beginning?" she said. "From the beginning. The plan was this. Drive the entire Mercer herd, 463 head, northeast across 230 miles of open country to the railhead at Caldwell Junction, where a regional cattle shortage had pushed prices to nearly 3 times what the local market was offering. Evelyn had found the price information in a trade bulletin that Marcus Cross had subscribed to and that kept arriving at the house addressed to a dead man. She had been reading it for months. The Caldwell Junction figure had appeared in the September issue, and she had circled it in pencil and said nothing for 2 days while she checked the route against the county survey maps and the elevation data she'd been collecting since August. 230 miles, Clay had said when she laid it out on the kitchen table. In November. The first 100 are the worst. After that, the terrain opens up. We'd need to move fast. 6, 7 weeks. 6 if we push. 7 if conditions force us slower. She put her finger on the map, tracing the route northeast through broken country that the main cattle trails had never bothered with because it was hard and waterless, and nobody had ever seen a reason to cross it if you didn't have to. There are 2 reliable water sources in the first section. After that, it gets complicated. Complicated, Clay had repeated. There's a third source, a stock pond near the Reeves property line that may or may not hold water at this point in the season. And after that, the next confirmed water is 40 miles out. 40 miles without water kills cattle. It kills cattle if you don't find an alternative. She looked at him steadily. I've been going through survey maps from the territorial period. There's a canyon system in the middle section, here, that the original surveys mention as having a spring source. It's not on any current map because nobody's been through that terrain with cattle in 30 years. Because it's impassable with cattle. Because people assumed it was. She held his gaze. That's not the same thing. He had asked her 3 more questions that evening, hard practical questions about water weight and daily mileage and what happened to cattle condition over that kind of distance in that kind of terrain, and she had answered all of them from the notebook without hesitation. And then he had gone to bed and lain awake for 2 hours, and in the morning he had said yes. That had been 3 weeks ago. Now it was the 1st of November, and they were moving. The herd went out at dawn on a Tuesday, which felt appropriate to Clay in a grim sort of way. Tuesday being the day things fell apart, and this being the kind of decision that might fall apart spectacularly. He rode point with Tomas while Evelyn drove the supply wagon at the rear with the 2 new hands she'd hired from the South Quarter, brothers named Reyes and Delgado, who were steady and quiet and had come with their own horses and their own gear and asked for nothing beyond fair wages and to be treated without contempt, which Evelyn had agreed to without making a ceremony of it. Grover and Pete held the flanks. 5 people, 463 cattle. 230 miles of country that had no particular interest in their survival. The first day went reasonably. The cattle were fresh and moved without trouble across the flat eastern section of the county, and by afternoon they had covered 14 miles, which was good. Clay watched the herd move and tried to feel encouraged by it, and mostly managed. The second day they lost a steer to a broken leg in a dry wash. The animal went down in loose rock, and the leg snapped clean, and there was nothing to do but what they did. Reyes handled it without being asked, quickly and without waste, and they moved on. By the 4th day, Clay's back hurt in the specific way that riding long days produced, and his water consumption was outpacing what he'd planned, which he noted without sharing. The cattle were showing the first signs of thirst irritability, the low, constant moving, the refusal to settle at night, and the first reliable water source was still 6 miles out. They'll make it, Evelyn said, riding up beside him at midday. She was on the smaller of the 2 horses she'd brought, a gray mare named Frances who had turned out to be more capable than she looked, which Clay had privately noted. "I know they'll make it to the water," he said. "It's what comes after." "One problem at a time," she said. "That's easy to say from a wagon." She looked at him. "I've been out of the wagon since 6 this morning." He had nothing to say to that, because it was true. She had ridden out to help Delgado with a cluster of cattle breaking left on the eastern flank before Clay had even finished his coffee, and she had been in the saddle since. He was tired and his back hurt, and he was taking it out sideways on a woman who didn't deserve it. "Sorry," he said. She accepted it with a nod and rode back toward the flank, and Clay watched her go and thought that an apology from him was becoming less remarkable to her over time, which he decided was probably a good sign. The stock pond near the Reeves property line held water. Not much. A third of its usual depth, brown and slow, but enough. The cattle drank for 2 hours while the crew rested and ate, and no one said much. Pete fell asleep against a wheel of the supply wagon. Grover sharpened a knife. Tomas sat with his boots off and his feet on the dry ground and looked at the sky the way a man did when he was calculating something he didn't want to calculate. "How far to the next one?" Reyes asked. He was the older of the two brothers, maybe 30, with a methodical quality that Clay had come to appreciate. He always asked the right practical question. 40 miles, Evelyn said, which is why we're pushing for 20 tonight and 20 tomorrow before the sun peaks. Night driving, Reyes said. Not a complaint, just accounting for it. Moonrise is at 9. It'll be enough to move by. She was looking at the map, the territorial one she'd had copied and enlarged before they left. If we're on schedule, we hit the canyon system by late afternoon on day 8. That's where the spring should be. Should be, Tomas said. Should be, Evelyn repeated, without flinching from it. I'm not going to pretend it's certain, but the geological indicators on the survey were consistent with a reliable source. The formation type, the depth markings, the fact that the surveyor noted it as an outflow rather than standing water. Outflow means it's fed from somewhere. And if it's dry, Tomas said, then we move to the contingency. She looked up from the map. There's a secondary route that adds 2 days but loops around to a confirmed tank on the Hargrove holdings. It'll cost us time and cattle condition, but it's survivable. Nobody said the obvious thing, which was that 2 days of extra driving with dehydrated cattle in November was not survivable in any comfortable sense of the word. They all knew it. Evelyn knew it better than any of them, and had said it anyway, because that was the kind of honesty she operated with. Pete woke up, looked around, and put his boots back on. Well, he said, to no one in particular, better get moving. What? Day 7 was when it went wrong. They were 12 miles from the canyon when Tomas came back from the front at a hard ride and pulled up beside Clay with an expression Clay hadn't seen on him before. Not panic, but something adjacent to it, held down by will. The water ahead, Tomas said. The tank we were planning to stop at tonight, the one marked on the territorial map. What about it? Dead cattle around it. 3, 4 of them. Not ours. Different brand. Older. He paused. The water smells wrong. Clay felt the cold thing move through him that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite anger. The specific sensation of something being worse than you'd planned for. How wrong? He said. Wrong enough that I didn't let the lead cattle near it. They rode forward together. The tank was a shallow depression fed by a pipe from an underground cistern, the kind of installation that had been built on this route decades ago for exactly the kind of drive they were on. The 4 dead cattle around it were trail-thin and stiff, dead at least 2 days. The water had a faint sulfurous quality underneath something sharper. Not natural, not a mineral problem. Somebody put something in it, Clay said. Tomas said nothing, which was agreement. Clay stood there for a moment looking at the dead cattle and the poisoned water and the 40 miles of dry country behind them and the canyon system ahead, and he felt the full weight of the situation settle on him the way heavy things settle, some, not all at once, but completely. He went back to where Evelyn had the supply wagon stopped. She had already climbed down and was walking toward the tank. He waited. She stood at the edge for a long time, looked at the dead cattle, looked at the water, bent down and smelled it without touching it, straightened up. Copper sulfate, she said. High concentration. Mixed with something else, maybe. I can't tell exactly. She turned to look at him. Someone knew we were coming this way. Dodd. Or someone who works for him. It doesn't matter which right now. She looked at the crew, who had gathered at a distance. The cattle were milling behind them, uneasy with the smell, beginning to push against the flank riders. What matters is we have thirsty cattle, no water source for at least another 15 miles on the main route, and about 4 hours of good light. Clay looked at her. He could see it in her face. Not despair, but the particular tightness of a person who has reached a moment they prepared for, and are now finding out whether the preparation was enough. The canyon, he said. The canyon, she said. Tonight. Evelyn, if that spring is dry, I know. She looked at him directly. I know what it means. But the alternative is standing here and watching them die slowly, or turning back and losing everything we've spent 3 months building. She held his gaze and didn't offer him false comfort. The canyon gives us a chance. Standing here gives us nothing. He looked at the crew. Tomas, who was watching him with the same steady patience he brought to everything. Reyes and Delgado, who had signed on for this and were still here. Grover, expressionless. Pete, who was old enough that he could have retired twice over and had chosen not to. All right, Clay said. Tell me exactly where we're going. What followed was the hardest 6 hours of Clay's life, and he had not had an easy life. Evelyn navigated from horseback with the survey map folded across her saddle, calling directions to Tomas, who relayed them down the line. The canyon system opened from the south through a narrow defile that the map showed, but that looked, from ground level, like solid rock face until you were almost on top of it, a crack in the limestone that widened gradually into a passage wide enough for cattle to move through single file if you pushed. Moving 463 head of stressed, thirsty cattle through a narrow rock canyon in fading light was not something that had a good version. It had a survivable version and several catastrophic ones, and which version you got depended on the front of the herd and the behavior of the point cattle and the question of whether the passage widened fast enough or whether it tightened into a dead end that would cause a reversal and a crush. It widened. Not easily. Not without 2 near stampedes that Reyes and Tomas managed by getting in front of the leads and holding them by main force and sheer nerve, but the canyon opened into a broader floor a mile in, and then 2 miles in it opened further, and the limestone walls fell back and the floor became sand and gravel. And then, around a bend that Evelyn had found on the territorial survey by the notation outflow, reliable, seasonal, the ground went dark and wet, and the smell of water came up through the dry air like something that had been promised a long time ago. The spring was there, not abundant, not a rushing source, but real, coming up through a crack in the canyon floor and running a slow trickle along a channel that had worn itself into the rock over more years than anyone present could count. Enough. If they let the cattle in groups and managed the access and gave the springtime between groups to recover, there was enough. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Pete said, quietly, "I'll be damned." And Evelyn, who had been holding the map so tightly the paper was damp at the edges, let out a breath that she'd been holding, Clay thought, for about 3 days. "Groups of 40, she said. "Rotate every 20 minutes. Tomas, can you manage the order?" "Yes," Tomas said. He looked at her with something that wasn't quite new. He had been looking at her differently for weeks, but was more visible now, in the canyon, in the thin light. Respect, without qualification. They worked through the night in shifts, managing the water access by lamplight, keeping the cattle moving enough to prevent crowding and still enough to prevent panic. Clay took the first watch, and Evelyn took the second. And when Clay came back from 2 hours of sleep, he found her standing at the spring's edge, counting cattle through with the same methodical attention she brought to her ledger columns. "You should sleep," he said. "I will," she said without moving. He stood beside her for a while. The canyon walls rose on both sides in the dark, blocking the sky except for a strip of stars directly overhead. The cattle sounds echoed differently in the enclosed space. Softer somehow, less distressed. "You were right," he said. She looked at him. "About the spring? About the route? About all of it." He said it straight, without decoration, because she deserved the straight version. I've been running this ranch my whole life, and you've been here 4 months, and you found what I couldn't find, and you were right." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "I had better maps," she said finally. "Evelyn, I know what you're saying, Clay." She looked back at the cattle. "Thank you." They stood there in the canyon together with the water running slow over the rock and the stars overhead, and the cattle finally quiet, and neither of them said anything else for a while, and that was all right. Botam. They came out of the canyon system on the morning of day 9 with the herd intact. All 463 head, not one lost in the crossing. Moving northeast again on ground that flattened and firmed as the terrain opened up toward the long approach to Caldwell Junction. The cattle were thin and they were tired, and so was every person moving them, but they were walking in the right direction and they were alive, which was more than Dodd had planned for. Clay rode point with the sun on his left shoulder and the wind at his back and thought about the map on the kitchen wall at Mercer Ranch, covered in pencil notations, and about the woman who had made those notations one careful mark at a time over 4 months of looking at what was there rather than what everyone else had decided to see. 40 miles ahead was Caldwell Junction. 40 miles behind was the poisoned water and the narrow canyon and every doubt he'd carried since August. He rode. Caldwell Junction was not a beautiful town. It was a functional one, built around the railhead the way all railhead towns were built, with the stockyards at the center and everything else arranged around them like an afterthought. The smell hit them 2 miles out, which meant the yards were active, which meant the buyers were there, which was the only thing that mattered. They came in on a Wednesday morning, 11 days after leaving Mercer Ranch, with the herd strung out along the approach road in a line that drew attention from the yard workers before they even reached the gate. 463 head, trail thin but walking straight, led by a crew of 5 people who looked like they had slept in their clothes for a week and a half because they had. The yard manager, a heavy-set man named Colbert, who wore his authority in the set of his jaw, came out to meet them at the gate. He looked at the herd for a long moment. Then he looked at Clay, then at Evelyn, then back at the herd. "Where'd you come from?" he said. "Clearwater County," Clay said. "Southwest." "There's no direct route from Clearwater County." "There is now," Evelyn said from beside him. Colbert looked at her. His expression went through several things quickly. Surprise, reassessment, something that was almost respect, and then settled back into professional neutrality. "You go through the canyon breaks?" "We did." "With 400 head?" 463, she said. "All of them present." Colbert looked at the herd again. He pulled a folded paper from his coat, the market sheet. Clay could see the column format from where he sat, and ran his thumb down a column without looking away from the cattle. "Current buyer price is $11.40 per hundredweight on grade beef," he said. "Your animals are trail conditioned. I can offer $10.80. $11.20, Evelyn said immediately. "They're light from the drive, but structurally sound. Grade quality holds. Your buyers aren't going to find 400 head anywhere else this week. The drought has killed most of the other drives before they reached you." Colbert's mouth moved slightly. 11 flat. 11.15, Evelyn said. "And you processed them today before the afternoon heat." A pause. Colbert looked at Clay, which was the kind of thing men did in negotiations when there was a woman across from them. Looked for the real authority, the one they were supposed to be talking to. Clay looked back at him without expression and said nothing. Colbert looked back at Evelyn. 11:10, he said, "and I'll get them to the scales by noon." Evelyn looked at Clay once, not for permission, just the shared acknowledgement between two people who have survived 11 days of hard country together. He nodded. 11:10, she said. "We'll need the paperwork by end of day." The final number, calculated against the weight sheets that Colbert's men ran through the scale house over the course of that afternoon, was $9,412. Clay sat with that number at a table in the railhead office while Colbert's clerk prepared the payment documents, and he could not quite make it feel real. $9,000. More than half again what the original debt to Dodd had been. Enough to cover everything: the operating deficit, the payroll gap, the feed costs, the 2 months of reserve they'd burned through, and have a significant remainder. Evelyn sat across from him with her notebook open, working through figures he couldn't quite follow, her pencil moving fast. She had washed her face and brushed the trail dust from her jacket and looked in the flat light of the office, like a woman who had done what she came to do and was already thinking about what came next. After operating costs and payroll through December, she said, without looking up, we net approximately $6,200, give or take. $6,000. Clear. That's enough to... Clay started. Buy the Gerhardt property, she said. Yes? She looked up. The sale listing is still active. They're asking $1,200 for the parcel, which is low because they needed to sell fast and still haven't found a buyer. With our documentation from this sale as backing, we can secure a note from the Caldwell Bank for the difference and pay it off inside 18 months. Clay stared at her. You've already looked at the listing. I looked at it in September, she said. I was waiting to see if we'd have the capital. He laughed, a short, genuine laugh that surprised him, and apparently surprised her, because she looked up again with an expression that was almost uncertain, as though she wasn't sure if she'd said something wrong. Evelyn, he said, when exactly did you decide we were going to be all right? She considered this with the same seriousness she brought to questions about water tables. October, she said finally, when Grover said he was staying. That's what did it. Grover? Grover doesn't stay anywhere without a reason, she said. He's been doing this longer than either of us. If he thought it was hopeless, he would have left. Clay thought about Grover sharpening his knife at the stock pond, the economy of it, the certainty. Fair point, he said. They arrived back in Clearwater on a Friday evening, which gave the town the weekend to process what had happened. The story moved fast, faster than the Clearwater Creek had moved in 8 months, which was not saying much, but felt appropriate. Colbert at Caldwell Junction talked, because yard managers always talked, and the news traveled south along the cattle corridors, the way news with money attached always traveled, with speed and embellishment, and a detail or two that got sharper with each retelling. By Saturday morning, most of Clearwater knew that the Mercers had come in from the southwest with a full herd through terrain nobody used and sold at a price nobody else was getting, while the competing ranches were still 3 days out with cattle that had been on dry range for 2 months. By Saturday afternoon, the competing ranches had arrived. Clay was in the barn when Tomas came in and said, quietly, that 4 wagons from the Dodd-connected operations had rolled into the Caldwell yards that morning with cattle in visibly poor condition and had been offered $8 per hundredweight, more than $3 below what the Mercers had negotiated, because the market had begun to clear on Wednesday and the premium stock prices had gone with it. How bad? Clay asked. Willard Ranch brought in about 200 head, Tomas said. The buyer at Caldwell told Reyes's cousin they were turned away from the premium pen entirely. Condition grade. They'll sell, but at whatever the buyer decides to offer. He paused. Whitmore's personal herd, the one he runs through that holding company, came in on Thursday. 60 head, half of them dehydrated. The yard manager put them in the recover pen. Clay didn't say anything for a moment. He was not a man who celebrated other people's misfortune, or tried not to be. But there was something that moved through him that he recognized as justice, not the satisfying, clean version that stories told about, but the real kind, which was imperfect and partial and still better than nothing. What about Dodd? He said. Dodd didn't send cattle, Tomas said. He deals in land and debt, not livestock. But his people... He stopped. What? Pruitt told me this morning that Dodd was in the bank on Thursday. Long meeting. Closed door. Tomas looked at his boots, then back up. Word is the Abilene consortium he's been working with, the land buyers, has pulled back from the arrangement. They don't invest in operations where the opposition is outperforming the principal. Clay absorbed this. The consortium was backing Dodd's consolidation play. Was, Tomas said. Apparently seeing us come out of that canyon with a full herd changed someone's calculation. Evelyn was at the kitchen table when Clay came in, which was where she usually was at this hour. But the papers in front of her were different. Not the ranch ledgers, but legal documents. The kind with narrow print and formal headings that she read the way most people read letters, with complete attention and no visible emotion. The Gerhardt sale went through, she said without looking up. I sent the paperwork from Caldwell. The bank confirmed this morning. She turned a page. We close in 3 weeks. Clay sat down. 260 acres. 268, actually. There's a small parcel on the north edge that wasn't in the original listing. The Gerhardts included it at no additional cost because nobody else wanted it. She finally looked up. It has the best soil moisture reading of anything in the county. I tested it in August. You tested it in August? I was walking fence lines, she said mildly. I was already out there. Clay looked at his wife across the kitchen table. She had a smear of ink on her left hand from the documents, and her hair was coming loose again, which it always did by evening, and she was looking at him with the same direct, undefended gaze she'd had the first day he'd sat across from her in the house with the pots on the porch railing. He had agreed to this marriage because he had no options. He understood now, sitting here, that he'd been wrong about that. Not about having no options, but about what this marriage was. It was not the last resort of a man with nowhere to go. It was the best decision he'd made in his adult life, arrived at by the worst possible route, which seemed about right for how the significant things happened. Evelyn, he said. She waited. I want to say something, and I'm not going to say it well, so I'm asking you to listen past the way I say it to what I mean. She set down her pen. All right. When Dodd offered me that arrangement, I thought he was destroying me. I thought marrying you was the price of losing, the thing you accept when you've lost badly enough that you don't have the right to refuse anymore. He paused. He was not a man who talked about his interior much, and the unfamiliarity showed. I was wrong about that. Not just wrong about you specifically, though I was wrong about that too. I was wrong about what I was measuring. I was measuring reputation and what men would think and whether I could hold my head up at the feed store. I wasn't measuring what actually builds something. Evelyn was quiet. She was looking at him with an expression he couldn't fully read, which was uncommon. He'd gotten better at reading her over 4 months. What does actually build something? She said. Paying attention, he said. Being right more than you're wrong. Staying when it's easier to go. He met her eyes. You knew where the water was. I didn't know enough to look. She looked down at the table for a moment. When she looked back up, her expression had shifted to something more open, less guarded. The face of someone who had been waiting a long time to be seen accurately and was finding the experience harder to sit with than they'd expected. I'm not easy to be married to, she said. I know that. I make decisions before I tell people about them. I work when I should sleep. I don't... She stopped. The things most people expect from a wife, I'm not... I know what you are, Clay said, deliberately echoing the words he'd used in Dodd's office 4 months ago. But he meant something different by them now, and she heard the difference. She let out a breath. Okay, she said simply. Okay, he said. It was not a romantic scene. They were sitting at a kitchen table covered in legal documents, both tired, with ink on her hand and dust still on his boots, and what passed between them was not the kind of thing that announced itself, but it was real in the way that real things were, not smooth, not perfect, but durable. The town came around the way towns always did, not all at once and not gracefully. Pruitt was first, arriving at the ranch on a Monday with a crate of fence staples and the manner of a man performing an act of partial contrition. He didn't apologize exactly. He said the fence staples were for the East Line and that he'd heard they'd had some trouble out there, which was as close as Pruitt could get to acknowledging what he'd watched happen without intervening. Clay took the staples and said thank you and didn't make Pruitt say more than he was able to. Others followed in their own ways. The liveryman's wife, who had told Evelyn about the gossip with the air of doing her a favor, came by in December with a jar of preserves, and the information that she had told several people in town that the rumors about the Dallas debts were entirely fabricated, which she presented as a gift. Evelyn thanked her for it. 2 smaller ranchers, men named Falk and Corrette, who had been watching all summer from a careful distance, came out in December to ask about the grazing cooperative arrangement Evelyn had set up with Dunbar, which had by then expanded to include shared fence maintenance and a water cost sharing agreement for the Dunbar well. Both men had lost cattle over the summer and were looking at their finances with the particular expression of people who had been wrong about something and were considering the cost of staying wrong. Evelyn met with them at the kitchen table. Clay sat off to one side and listened to her explain the cooperative terms, the shared costs, the agreed rotations, the documentation requirements. with the same flat clarity she'd used in Dodd's office in August. No performance, no attempt to make them feel better about coming late. The water sharing covers what acreage? Falk asked. He was a big, slow-talking man who had worked his land for 20 years and distrusted paperwork on principle. Your eastern section and Corrette's north quarter would both fall inside the arrangement, Evelyn said. Shared usage fee, fixed per season, adjusted annually based on rainfall index. And you control the index? Falk said. The county survey office publishes it, Evelyn said. Nobody controls it. That's why it's useful. Falk looked at Corrette. Corrette shrugged, which for Corrette appeared to be the equivalent of an enthusiastic endorsement. All right, Falk said. We'll sign. Clay walked them out afterward, and Falk, at his wagon, paused and looked at Clay with the expression of a man working through something awkward. She's not what I expected, he said. No, Clay said. She's not. Falk nodded, got in his wagon, and drove away. And Clay stood in the yard in the December cold and thought that not what I expected was probably the closest Falk would ever come to an apology, and that it was also probably enough. Charmette. Dodd left Clearwater in January. Not dramatically. No visible collapse, no public failure. 1 week he was in his office on the main street, and the next his sign was down, and the word was that he'd relocated to Abilene to pursue other interests, which was the language people used for retreat when they didn't want to call it that. Whitmore stayed on in a reduced capacity, handling a few remaining accounts, working out of the hotel rather than an office, but the consolidated land operation that had been their primary play in Clearwater County was finished. The Abilene Consortium had withdrawn completely by December, which Tomas had heard from Reyes, who had heard it from someone at the Caldwell Yards. The official reason was a change in regional investment priorities. The real reason, which required no source to confirm, was that a consolidation strategy built on eliminating competition only worked when the competition could be eliminated. Clay heard about Dodd's departure from Pruitt, who delivered it with a studied neutrality that didn't quite conceal his satisfaction. Quiet departure, Pruitt said. Early morning. Didn't tell many people he was going. Sounds about right, Clay said. You going to say anything about what he did? The poisoned water tank, the fence cutting? Clay thought about the log Evelyn had kept since September. Every incident, dated and described and signed by the crew member who witnessed it. 47 entries. A pattern that was unambiguous on paper, built by 2 months of careful documentation by a woman who had understood from the beginning that what you could prove mattered more than what you knew. We have documentation, Clay said. If anything comes up legally, we're covered. But going after a man who's already gone costs money and time, and we have better uses for both right now. Pruitt nodded slowly. That's a measured position. It's Evelyn's position, Clay said. I thought about going after him. She talked me out of it. He picked up his supplies. She's usually right. Pruitt watched him go with the expression of a man updating his understanding of something he thought he'd already figured out. Outside in the January cold, Clay loaded the wagon and drove home to a ranch that was, for the first time in 4 years, entirely his, deeded, unencumbered, expanding, and to a woman at the kitchen table who was already on to the next problem, which was how it always was with her, and which he had stopped wanting to be otherwise. The rain came back in February. Not all at once. Texas didn't work that way, and anyone who had lived there long enough had stopped expecting it to. It came in pieces. 3 days of slow, steady rain in the second week of the month that soaked into the cracked ground without running off, which was the sign that the earth was genuinely drinking rather than deflecting. The creek bed on the eastern edge of Mercer Ranch began to show water by the third day, just a thin, dark line moving through the sand, but moving. Clay stood at the kitchen window and watched it rain and felt something release in his chest that had been tight since July. Behind him, Evelyn was at the table. She had a new map now. The county map had been replaced twice since August, each version larger and more detailed than the last, the margins dense with notations in her particular small handwriting. The current one covered most of the wall beside the fireplace and included not just Mercer land, but the Gerhardt parcel, the Dunbar grazing sections, and the eastern corridor they'd established as a shared route with Falk and Corrette's operations. The South Creek will reach the lower pasture by tomorrow if this keeps up, she said, without looking up from what she was writing. I know, Clay said. The new grass seed on the Gerhardt section needs another week of moisture to set properly. I know that too. She looked up. There was something almost amused in her expression, which was a thing he'd learned to recognize over the past 6 months. It didn't show the way amusement showed on most people, but it was there if you knew where to look. You're watching the rain like it owes you something. 8 months of dry, he said. It does. She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. It was the closest she usually got, and he had stopped wishing it were more. It was hers. That was enough. Spring came in hard and green, the way it did after a drought broke properly. Almost aggressive, like the land was making a point. The Gerhardt pasture, which had sat overgrazed and exhausted when the family abandoned it, responded to Evelyn's reseeding program faster than Clay had expected. By April, it was showing growth that the old Gerhardt operation hadn't seen in years, which Evelyn attributed to the soil moisture she'd measured in August, and which Clay attributed to whatever combination of science and stubbornness she applied to every problem she touched. They hired 2 more hands in March, a man named Vasquez who came from the same South County community as Reyes and Delgado, and a younger man, barely 20, named Samuel, who had showed up at the gate one morning asking for work with the specific, careful dignity of someone who had been turned away from other places and was not going to let that show. Evelyn had talked to him for 20 minutes in the yard and then come in and told Clay they were hiring him. He's young, Clay said. Tomas was 22 when your father hired him, she said. How did that work out? Clay couldn't argue with that and didn't try. Samuel turned out to be the best natural horseman on the property, which nobody had predicted, and by summer he was running the remuda with a quiet authority that the older hands respected without comment. That was the thing about the ranch that had changed most in a year. It was a place now where competence was the measure, and competence had a way of being recognized regardless of where it came from or what it looked like. It had taken time. It hadn't been smooth. Vasquez and Grover had a collision in June over a fence repair method that resulted in 2 days of cold silence and one very direct conversation that Tomas mediated and that Clay stayed out of entirely on Evelyn's advice. Let them work it out, she'd said. If you step in, you make it about you. If they work it out, it becomes theirs. They worked it out. By August, Grover was teaching Vasquez the particular way he set corner posts, which was Grover's version of full acceptance. These were not heroic moments. They were the ordinary friction of people learning to work together, and the ordinary friction was where most of the actual work happened. In May, a letter arrived from a man named Alderton, who represented a regional cattlemen's association headquartered in Fort Worth. The letter was addressed to both Clay and Evelyn Mercer, which was still unusual enough that Clay noticed it specifically. The association was holding a summer gathering to discuss drought response and regional water management, and they were requesting that the Mercers present their approach: the grazing rotation system, the water cooperative, the canyon route documentation. Clay read the letter twice and handed it to Evelyn. She read it once. Do you want to go? She said. Do you? I'm asking you, she said. This is your name on the letter, too. He thought about it. A room full of established cattlemen, Fort Worth, a formal presentation. A year ago, he would have gone out of obligation and spent the entire time managing other people's perceptions of him. Yeah, he said. I think I do. Then we go, she said, and went back to her ledgers. They drove to Fort Worth in June in the good wagon, which Tomas had repaired over the winter until it was more new than original. Evelyn brought the documentation files, the grazing records, the water cooperative agreements, the route maps with the canyon survey overlaid, the financial records from the Caldwell Junction sale. She had organized them into a leather case that she'd bought in Clearwater, and she carried it with the matter-of-fact confidence of someone who knew exactly what was in it. The gathering was held in a hotel meeting room with 40-odd men in good hats and the particular atmosphere of people who were used to being the most important person in most rooms. Clay watched the room shift slightly when they walked in, the small recalibration that happened when Evelyn appeared, the quick assessment that men made and that she had long since stopped tracking with any visible response. What happened over the next 2 hours was not a triumph. It was more complicated than that, and more interesting. Evelyn presented the water cooperative structure first, walking through the cost-sharing model and the rainfall index adjustment with the same directness she used at the kitchen table. Two men interrupted with questions that were more challenges than questions, the kind designed to expose a gap or establish dominance. And she answered both without raising her voice or losing her place, and the second man ended the exchange looking at his own notes rather than at her. An older rancher named Beaumont, who had the bearing of someone whose opinion the room generally waited for, asked about the canyon route. Evelyn unrolled the survey map on the table and walked him through it, and Beaumont looked at the territorial survey overlay and said, quietly, "Nobody's been through that break with cattle in 30 years. "We went through it with 463, Evelyn said. "Lost none." Beaumont looked at Clay. "Your wife planned the drive." "She planned everything," Clay said. "I moved cattle." It was the most honest summary he could give, and Beaumont seemed to understand that. He looked at Evelyn again with the reassessment that real attention produced, not the quick dismissal, but the slower, more uncomfortable recognition that what he'd assumed and what was true were different. "The spring in the canyon system," Beaumont said. "Is it reliable?" "Reliable enough for emergency use," Evelyn said. "We're working on documenting the flow rate seasonally. I expect to have 2 years of data by next spring, which would allow predictive modeling for drought years." "You're already planning to go back." "We're already going back," she said. "We went through in March to map the water table more precisely. Tomas and Reyes handled the survey equipment." Beaumont was quiet for a moment. He had the expression of a man doing arithmetic about time. How long something had taken, what had been accomplished in that time, what it implied. "How long have you been in Clearwater County?" he said. 10 months, Evelyn said. The room was quiet in a way that meant people were processing something they hadn't expected to process. Beaumont nodded once, the kind of nod that closed a calculation. "We should talk more at dinner," he said. "Both of you." They drove home from Fort Worth on a Sunday in a heat that was already building toward what looked like a real summer rather than a drought. The land along the road had recovered enough to show green in the low places, and the cattle they passed in other people's fields looked better than they'd looked a year ago. Evelyn had her notebook open on her knee and was writing. "You didn't sleep last night," Clay said. "I was thinking." "About what Beaumont said." "About what Beaumont didn't say," she corrected. She looked up from the notebook. "He's going to bring the water cooperative model to the state association. He said we should talk, but what he meant was that he wants to understand the structure well enough to present it somewhere larger." "Is that a problem?" She considered this. "No, it means the idea spreads further than we can take it ourselves. That's better." She paused. "I want credit for it, though. Not personally. I mean, structurally. The documentation should be attributed to Mercer Ranch so that the origin is clear. So people know where it came from. So people know where to come when they have questions," she said. "Which is different." Clay looked at the road ahead. The wagon moved at its own pace, the horses knowing their way home at this point without much direction. "You're already thinking about what comes after the cooperative." "I'm always thinking about what comes after," she said. "That's not ambition. It's just how I work." He knew that about her now, the way her mind moved forward while other people were still catching up to the present. It had frustrated him sometimes in the early months, the sense of being one step behind a person who had already accounted for where you'd be next. He'd gotten used to it the way you got used to working with a partner who was faster at certain things and slower at others, and whose speed in one area meant you had to hold your own in different ones. He was better at the animals, at the physical work of moving cattle and reading land, at the particular human management of men like Grover and Pete, who communicated in ways that required patience and a specific kind of attention. Evelyn was better at numbers and systems and the long view. They had divided the work not by agreement, but by natural gravity, each moving toward what they were built for, and the combination had turned out to be more than either of them would have been alone. That was not a romantic idea. It was a practical one. But the practical version had its own weight, its own truth, and Clay had learned not to undervalue things, because they were useful. What? In August, 1 year after the marriage that Clearwater had watched with the anticipation of people expecting a disaster, Mercer Ranch ran 1,200 head across 4 properties and employed 9 people at wages that were higher than the county average. Because Evelyn had run the calculation in January and determined that higher wages produced lower turnover, and lower turnover produced higher efficiency, and higher efficiency outperformed the savings from underpaying people inside of 2 years. Pete retired in August, formally, which was something Clay hadn't expected because Pete had never mentioned retirement as a concept. He showed up one morning and said he was 61 and his knees were done, and he was going to his daughter's family in San Antonio, and he wanted to say that this had been a good place to work this last year, better than it had been, and that he was glad he'd stayed. Clay shook his hand. Evelyn came out from the house and shook his hand too, and Pete held her hand a moment longer than a formal handshake required and said, "You're a hard woman to understand, Mrs. Mercer, but you're a fair one. That matters more." Then he got in the wagon his daughter's husband had sent for him and drove south. The space Pete left was absorbed the way the ranch absorbed most things now, not without difficulty, but without crisis. Samuel took on more responsibility. Tomas, who was 27 and had been doing the work of a foreman for a year without the title, got the title in September, and a wage adjustment that Evelyn had already budgeted for without telling Clay, which he found out when he looked at the September ledger. "You planned that before I agreed to it," he said. "I knew you'd agree," she said. "That's not the same thing." "You're right," she said, in a tone that acknowledged the point without retreating from the decision. "I'll tell you in advance next time." "Will you?" She considered this with the particular honesty she brought to questions about her own habits. "Probably not," she said, "but I'll try." It was the truest thing she could have said, and they both knew it, and Clay laughed again. The same surprised laugh he'd produced in the Caldwell Junction office, the one that seemed to come from somewhere he hadn't known was available. Right. There was a moment in October, 2 years after a Tuesday in Harlan Dodd's office, when a desperate man had accepted terms he didn't understand yet, that Clay thought was probably the closest thing to a clear picture of what they'd built. He was riding the south fence line in the late afternoon, checking the new wire that Samuel and Vasquez had run in September. The light was coming in low and flat from the west, the kind of October light that turned the dry grass gold and made the land look the way it probably looked to someone seeing it for the first time. He could see the ranch house from the ridge, the original structure plus the addition they'd put on the east side in spring, which gave Evelyn the office space she'd been working out of the bedroom corner since August. He could see the barn, the new water trough system Evelyn had designed with a gravity feed line from the elevated tank that Vasquez had built over the summer. He could see the cattle on the Gerhardt pasture, which was producing at twice the rate it had under the original owners. He could see the thin line of the Eastern Creek, which had been running since February. It was not perfect. The addition on the house had a window that didn't hang quite level, because the carpenter from Clearwater had measured twice and still cut wrong, and they'd decided to live with it. The gravity feed system had a slow leak at the second junction that Vasquez had repaired 3 times and would probably repair again. There were still people in Clearwater who had not updated their opinions about Evelyn, though there were fewer of them, and the ones who remained had gotten quieter because quiet was less comfortable than it used to be. Dodd was in Abilene. Whitmore was somewhere. The land they had been trying to consolidate was now part of a cooperative arrangement that worked in the opposite direction from what they'd intended. Shared, rather than controlled, strengthening the small operations instead of eliminating them. None of this had happened the way Clay would have predicted. Not the marriage, not the drought, not the canyon, not Evelyn herself. None of it was what a man planning his life would have planned. It had happened the way real things happened, which was sideways, expensively, with setbacks that didn't announce themselves in advance, and with help from directions he hadn't thought to look. The thing Clay had learned, the thing he carried now with the particular weight of something earned rather than taught, was that the story people told about you was not the same as the life you were building. The town had told a story about Clay Mercer that summer, a desperate man who married unwisely and was waiting to fail. Dodd had told a story about what Evelyn Cross was and what she was capable of. Both stories were wrong, and both were wrong in the same direction. They mistook the surface for the substance, the appearance for the fact. Evelyn had never made that mistake. Not about land, not about water, not about people. She looked at what was actually there. It was the most useful thing he had ever seen anyone do, and it was the thing he was still learning and probably would be learning for the rest of his life. He turned his horse back toward the house. The kitchen light was on, which it usually was at this hour. He could see it from the ridge, warm and specific, a point of light in the late Texas afternoon. He rode toward it. Years later, and there would be years, more than either of them had counted on when they sat across from each other in that house with the pots on the porch railing and negotiated the terms of a practical arrangement, someone would ask Evelyn Mercer what the secret of the ranch was. A young woman, a rancher's daughter, who had heard the story in the way stories get heard when they've been told enough times, asked her at a county cooperative meeting what she had known that other people hadn't. Evelyn thought about this for a moment, the way she thought about everything. Not performing the thinking, just actually doing it. I didn't know more, she said. I just didn't assume. Most people come to a problem having already decided what the answer is. They're looking for confirmation, not information. She paused. I looked at the water table because I wanted to know where the water was, not because I expected it to be somewhere specific. I looked at the canyon because the survey said it was there, not because I was certain it would work. She looked at the young woman directly. The difference between assuming and looking is very small. The difference in outcomes is very large. The young woman wrote that down, which Evelyn noticed and didn't comment on. On the drive home that evening, Clay, who had been sitting in the back of the meeting room and had heard all of it, said, "That's the first time I've heard you say that out loud." "I've been thinking it for 3 years," Evelyn said. "What made you say it tonight?" She was quiet for a moment, watching the road in the early dark. "She reminded me of myself," she said, "young, and in a room where no one expected her to know anything. I thought it might be useful." Clay looked at his wife in the fading light. The round face, the dark hair, the steady way she held herself, which had not changed since the day he'd held a door for her at the general store, and she'd thanked him without making a ceremony of it. She was 37 now. She had added no pretense to herself in 3 years. She had not become what the town expected, or what Dodd had assumed, or what Clay himself, in his worst moments of doubt, had been afraid was beyond what either of them could sustain. She had stayed exactly what she was. That was, in the end, what had been hardest to understand and most necessary. "You know what I think?" Clay said. "Often, yes," she said, which was as close to warmth as she usually got in public, and which he had learned to receive exactly as it was given. "I think we did all right," he said. Evelyn looked at the road ahead. The Texas dark was coming down full now, stars beginning to show above the flat line of the horizon, and the land on both sides of the road was land that was alive again, that had water under it and grass on top of it, and people working it who were paid fairly and stayed of their own choosing. "We did," she said, simply, without decoration. The way she said things she actually meant. They drove home through the dark, and the ranch was waiting for them, and it was theirs. Part 5. Louis Tort viết 4.500 từ liên kết liên mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện và hội thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch, sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần, duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ, phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ, Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kể theo ngôi thứ 3, giữ đồ kịch tính không viết lan man, có quan điểm cá nhân, thông điệp, bài học, góc nhìn con người. Nhân vật không hoàn hảo, hội thoại tự nhiên, tránh ngôn ngữ văn chương sáo rơi và cụm từ AI điển hình. Viết như nhà văn chuyên nghiệp, không như AI cố gắng nghe sang. Có yếu tố con người, cấm miêu tả qua mượt mà và hoàn hảo, phần 5 giải quyết hết vấn đề và kết thúc trọn vẹn câu chuyện. Câu chuyện không nhắc đến Chúa. Lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn không nhảy sang document, chỉ dần bắt buộc, không được xuất hiện trong nội dung truyện. Đây là một câu chuyện điện ảnh hoàn toàn hư cấu được tạo ra chỉ nhằm mục đích giải trí, không đề cập hay ngụ ý rằng nó dựa trên sự kiện có thật, người thật hoặc câu chuyện có thật. Không sử dụng các cụm từ như dựa trên một câu chuyện có thật, theo ghi chép hoặc bất cứ điều gì tương tự. Tất cả các nhân vật, địa điểm, tổ chức và sự kiện phải hoàn toàn hư cấu. Show more 14 giờ 38 phút Part 5. What they built. The rain came back in February, which nobody had predicted and everybody needed. It arrived the way good things sometimes arrived after a long absence. Quietly, without announcement. Just a change in the smell of the air at dawn, and then a low sky moving in from the northwest, and then rain. 3 days of it, slow and steady, the kind that soaked into the ground instead of running off. The creek bed on the eastern edge of Mercer Ranch showed water by the second day. By the third, it was moving, thin and dark through the cracked sand, but moving. Clay stood at the kitchen window and watched it and felt something in his chest loosen that had been tight since the previous July, a full 7 months of tightness releasing all at once, which was almost painful in its own way. Behind him, Evelyn was at the table. The county map on the wall had been replaced twice since August, each version larger, more detailed, with her notations filling the margins in the small, precise handwriting that Clay had learned to read as fluently as he read the land itself. The current version covered most of the wall beside the fireplace and included not just Mercer land, but the Gerhardt parcel they'd closed on in December, the Dunbar grazing sections to the north, and the eastern corridor they'd established through the cooperative arrangement with Falk and Corrette. The South Creek will reach the lower pasture by tomorrow if this holds, she said without looking up. I know, Clay said. The reseeding on the Gerhardt section needs at least another week of moisture to set properly. I know that too. She looked up at him. There was something in her expression, not quite amusement, but the edge of it, the place where her face went when she was closer to smiling than she usually permitted herself. You're watching the rain like it owes you money. 8 months of nothing, he said. It does. She made a sound in her throat that was the closest thing to a laugh she typically produced in private, and he had long since stopped wishing it were something louder or more open. It was hers. It was real. That was the thing he'd figured out about Evelyn that most of Clearwater County had never bothered to learn. What she gave you was always genuine. She just didn't give more than she had. Spring came in hard and green the way it did after a drought broke properly. Almost aggressive, the land making up for lost time with a stubbornness that felt personal. The Gerhardt pasture, which had been exhausted and overgrazed when the family abandoned it, responded to Evelyn's reseeding program faster than Clay had expected. By April, it was producing growth that the original operation hadn't seen in years, which Evelyn credited to the soil moisture readings she'd taken the previous August, and which Clay privately credited to whatever particular combination of science and refusal she brought to every problem she touched. They hired 2 more hands in March, a man named Vasquez, who came from the same South County community as Reyes and Delgado and had been recommended by Reyes without qualification, which was recommendation enough, and a younger man, barely 20, named Samuel, who arrived at the gate one morning asking for work with the careful dignity of someone who had been turned away from other places and had decided not to let that show. Evelyn spoke with him for 20 minutes in the yard and came inside and told Clay they were hiring him. He's young, Clay said. Tomas was 22 when your father hired him, she said. How did that work out? He had no response to that and didn't manufacture one. Samuel turned out to be the best natural horseman on the property, which no one had predicted on the basis of a gate conversation, and by summer he was managing the remuda with a quiet authority that the older hands respected without needing to discuss it. That was the change Clay noticed most in the ranch over that first full year. Competence had become the measure of a person there, and competence had a way of being recognized regardless of where it came from or what it looked like. It had not happened by declaration. Evelyn had never given a speech about it. It had happened because she modeled it consistently and hired for it and paid for it, and those things together created a culture the same way water created a channel, slowly, without ceremony, and in the direction of least resistance. It was not a perfect operation. Nothing that involved cattle and weather and human beings could be. Vasquez and Grover had a collision in June over a fence repair method that produced 2 days of cold silence and one direct, uncomfortable conversation that Tomas mediated with the patience of a man who had spent years watching people work through friction. Clay stayed out of it entirely, on Evelyn's advice. If you step in, it becomes about you, she'd said. If they work it out, it becomes theirs. They worked it out. By August, Grover was teaching Vasquez the particular way he set corner posts, which for Grover was the equivalent of full unconditional acceptance. These were not heroic moments. They were the ordinary friction of people figuring out how to share work and space, and they were where most of the actual building happened. Not in the dramatic decisions, but in the daily small ones, the negotiations between people who had to keep seeing each other and therefore couldn't afford to stay wrong. Pete retired in August. He came in one morning with his hat in his hands and said he was 61 years old and his knees were finished and his daughter in San Antonio had room for him and he thought it was time. He said it the way Pete said everything, without flourish, looking straight at whoever he was talking to, not asking for a response beyond acknowledgement. Clay shook his hand. Evelyn came out from the house and shook his hand too, and Pete held her hand a moment longer than a formal handshake required, and looked at her in the particular way that older men looked at things they'd reconsidered. "You're a hard woman to understand, Mrs. Mercer," he said, "but you're a fair one. I've worked for a lot of people in 40 years. Fair is rarer than most of them think it is." Evelyn accepted this without deflecting it, which was its own kind of respect. "Take care of your knees," she said. Pete got in the wagon his daughter's husband had sent and drove south, and Clay watched him go from the yard and felt the particular mix of things you felt when someone who was part of something left it. Not grief exactly, but the acknowledgement that time moved even when you weren't watching it. Tomas got the foreman title in September, which Evelyn had already budgeted for without telling Clay, which he discovered when he reviewed the September ledger. "You planned that before I agreed to it," he said, at the kitchen table that evening. "I knew you'd agree," she said. "That's not the same as asking." She considered this with the honest self-examination she brought to questions about her own habits, which he had come to appreciate even when its conclusions were inconvenient. "You're right," she said. I'll tell you in advance next time." "Will you?" A pause. "Probably not," she said, "but I mean to." It was the most accurate thing she could have said, and they both knew it, and Clay laughed. The same surprised laugh he'd first produced in the Caldwell Junction office, the one that came from somewhere he hadn't known was accessible. Evelyn watched him with that near smile, and for a moment the kitchen table felt like a place where two people had arrived after a long distance, neither of them entirely sure when the arriving had happened. In May, a letter came from a man named Alderton, representing a regional cattlemen's association in Fort Worth. It was addressed to both Clay and Evelyn Mercer, which was still unusual enough that Clay read the salutation twice. The association was organizing a summer gathering on drought response and regional water management and wanted the Mercers to present their approach: the grazing rotation, the water cooperative, the canyon route documentation. "Do you want to go?" Evelyn asked after reading it. "I'm asking you first," Clay said. She looked at him with the expression she had when she was deciding whether to say the direct thing. "This is your land and your name in this county. I want to know if you want to go before I decide what I want." He thought about a year ago. The version of himself who had sat in Dodd's office, calculating what other men would think, whether he could hold his head up at the feed store, whether the shape of his reputation could survive the shape of his marriage. That man had been measuring the wrong things, and the measurement had nearly cost him everything. "Yeah," he said, "I want to go." They drove to Fort Worth in June in the repaired wagon, Evelyn with her leather document case on her knee and Clay in his good shirt, which he'd ironed himself with more difficulty than he expected. The gathering was held in a hotel meeting room with 40-odd ranchers in good hats, and the atmosphere of men who were accustomed to authority and slightly suspicious of anything that challenged their picture of how things worked. Clay watched the room adjust when they walked in, the small recalibration, the quick assessments, the glances that moved from him to Evelyn and back. He had seen this in Clearwater for a year and had learned to let it pass through him without catching on anything. Evelyn presented the water cooperative structure first, walking through the cost-sharing model and the rainfall index adjustment without notes, from the same kind of direct clarity she used at the kitchen table. Two men interrupted with questions that were more challenges than questions, the kind of questions designed to find a gap or establish position, and she answered both without losing pace, and the second man ended the exchange looking at his hands. An older rancher named Beaumont who had the kind of quiet weight that meant the room deferred to him without anyone deciding to, asked about the canyon route. Evelyn unrolled the survey map on the table and walked him through the territorial overlay, the geological indicators, the flow rate data she'd been collecting since March. Beaumont looked at the map for a long time. "Nobody's taken cattle through that break in 30 years, he said. "We took 463 through in November," Evelyn said. "Lost none." Beaumont looked at Clay. "Your wife planned the drive?" "She planned everything," Clay said. "I moved cattle and tried not to get in the way." It was the most honest summary available, and Beaumont seemed to understand that honest summaries were what they were dealing with. He looked at Evelyn again, the longer, recalibrating look, the one that meant a person was updating something they'd assumed without examining it. "How long have you been in Clearwater County, Sue?" he said. 14 months at the time of the drive, Evelyn said. 22 now. The room was quiet in a way that had content to it. 40 men doing the arithmetic of what had been built in 22 months, comparing it against what most operations managed in decades. Beaumont nodded slowly. "I'd like to talk more at dinner," he said. "Both of you." At dinner, Beaumont talked less than Clay expected and listened more, which Clay recognized as the habit of someone who already understood that they were learning something rather than confirming what they knew. He asked Evelyn about the survey maps, where she'd found the territorial records, how she'd known to look for geological indicators in the canyon system. She explained it straightforwardly, without making it sound impressive, which somehow made it more impressive. Near the end of the evening, Beaumont said, "The water cooperative model. You'd be willing to let other operations use the documentation?" "That's why we brought copies," Evelyn said, and reached into the leather case. On the drive home, Clay said, "He's going to bring that to the state association." "I know," Evelyn said. "That's what we came for." He looked at her in the wagon in the late evening. "You knew before we left." "I knew it was possible," she said. "That's different from knowing." "Not by much in your case," he said. She didn't deny it. Yet, the town of Clearwater finished coming around the way towns finish things, gradually, without acknowledging the process, as though they had always felt this way and simply hadn't had occasion to express it. The liveryman's wife, who had watched Evelyn through an upstairs window on the day she'd arrived in town, organized a county women's social in September and sent an invitation to Evelyn that was phrased with a formality that functioned as an apology without using the word. Evelyn went, which surprised Clay, and came back 2 hours later with information about 3 families in the county who were struggling through the tail end of the drought and might benefit from the cooperative arrangement. "You went for the intelligence," Clay said. "I went because it was an invitation," she said. The intelligence was incidental. A pause. And useful. Falk and Corrette formalized their cooperative membership in the fall and brought in a third rancher, a widow named Hester Crane, who had been managing her late husband's operation alone for 2 years with more competence than anyone had given her credit for. Evelyn recognized this immediately and said so directly, which startled Hester Crane and then seemed to settle something in her. Pruitt at the hardware store had by now repositioned himself as a quiet supporter of the Mercers, which expressed itself in small, practical ways, good information delivered without being asked for, credit terms extended without negotiation, that Clay accepted without making a ceremony of it. Pruitt needed to feel he'd been on the right side of things, and Clay was willing to let him feel that, because the alternative cost more energy than it was worth. There were still people in Clearwater who had not updated their opinions about Evelyn, fewer than before, and quieter, because quiet was less exposed than it used to be. Clay had stopped expecting unanimity and started measuring what he actually had, which was more than he'd built in the preceding decade and more than Dodd had expected to leave him with. Dodd. Clay thought about Dodd sometimes, the way you thought about weather that had passed, not with particular feeling, but with the acknowledgement that it had happened and had shaped the ground it moved across. Dodd was in Abilene now, working smaller operations in territory where his particular method of patient predation still found purchase. He had not been brought to legal account for the poisoned water tank, which Clay had sat with for a while before arriving at the same conclusion Evelyn had reached first. Pursuing it cost time and money and attention they needed for building, and a man like Dodd was punished more completely by the failure of his plans than by anything a county court would impose. Whitmore had stayed in Clearwater through the spring and then drifted north, and no one had marked his leaving with particular ceremony. The land they had been trying to consolidate was now inside a cooperative structure that worked in precisely the opposite direction from what they'd intended. Distributed rather than controlled, strengthening small operations rather than eliminating them, with documentation that bore the Mercer name and had reached Fort Worth, and from there would go further. That was the particular satisfaction Clay had not anticipated, that the thing built in resistance to Dodd's method had become its own argument against that method, visible and legible to anyone who looked. In October, 2 years after a Tuesday in Harlan Dodd's office, Clay rode the south fence line in the late afternoon to check the new wire Samuel and Vasquez had run in September, and from the ridge above the Gerhardt pasture he could see everything they had built laid out in the low autumn light. The ranch house, with the addition they'd put on the east side in spring for Evelyn's office. The window that didn't quite hang level because the carpenter from Clearwater had measured wrong, and they'd decided to live with it. The barn and the water trough system with the gravity feed line that had a slow leak at the second junction that Vasquez had repaired 4 times and would likely repair again. The Gerhardt pasture producing double what it had under its previous owners. The thin line of the Eastern Creek, running since February. Cattle on 4 properties moving through rotations that Tomas managed now from memory, having internalized Evelyn's system to the point where it had become his own. 9 people working this land, fed, paid fairly, staying of their own choice. It was not a picture-perfect vista. The addition window bothered Clay slightly every time he looked at it. The creek ran but ran thin in dry weeks. There were mornings when the cattle count came up short and the search turned up the missing animals in an inconvenient location, and the repair that followed took time they didn't have. There were weeks when the ledger was tighter than Evelyn's projections had suggested, and she would sit at the table with the accounts spread out and her pencil moving and her jaw set in the particular way that meant she was finding an answer but hadn't found it yet. That was the ranch. Not the triumph of it, but the daily weight of it. The ongoing negotiation between what you planned and what actually happened, which never fully converged and which you kept attempting anyway because the alternative was to stop. Clay had learned something in 2 years that he couldn't have been told in advance, not because no one would have said it, but because it was the kind of knowledge that only existed on the other side of experience. He had spent most of his adult life trying to hold a position, the position of the man who knew what he was doing, who managed his land the way his father had managed it, whose reputation in Clearwater was legible and stable and didn't require defense. That position had cost him everything it was supposed to protect, because it was built on not changing rather than on being right, and those were not the same thing. Evelyn had never tried to hold a position. She had tried to be accurate. That was the difference, and it was the whole difference, and it took watching someone do it for 2 years in close proximity before he understood it well enough to attempt it himself. He was still learning it. He made assumptions he caught himself making and had to back out of. He deferred to old habits in moments of stress and then corrected afterward. He was slower to update than Evelyn and faster than he'd been, which was the only direction that mattered. He rode back toward the house in the October light. That evening, Tomas stayed late to go over the winter rotation plan with Evelyn at the kitchen table. Clay sat at the far end with his coffee and listened to the two of them work. The back and forth of it, Tomas raising practical objections from his knowledge of how the cattle moved in cold weather. Evelyn adjusting the plan in real time, noting the changes in the margin of her notebook. They had developed a working language over a year and a half that had its own shorthand, its own assumptions, built from the specific history of this land and these animals. When Tomas left, Clay said, "He's good." "He was always good," Evelyn said, gathering the papers. "He just needed someone to ask him where the ground was wet." It was the same thing she'd said in a different way 18 months ago, and it landed differently now, with the weight of everything that had happened since. Clay thought about his father's ranch hands, the men who had worked those years without being asked what they knew and what that had cost in aggregate. Not maliciously, just through the ordinary failure of attention, the assumption that knowing came from ownership rather than from looking. "I've been thinking about something," Clay said. Evelyn looked up. "When we started this, I thought you were the business end of the arrangement, and I was the land in the name, the thing you needed access to. He said it without embarrassment because it was accurate, and accuracy was what she'd always given him. I've been thinking that was wrong. Not wrong about what you needed. You did need access, that part was true, but wrong about what I was. She waited, which was what she did when she thought someone hadn't finished. I'm not just the land, he said. I know this country. I know how to read cattle and how to read weather and how to manage men like Grover who don't talk. I know things that aren't in survey maps. He paused. I've been undervaluing that because I felt like I was always the slower one, the one catching up. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. She had the expression she got when something required a considered answer rather than a quick one. You've been slower at some things, she said finally. I've been slower at others. I can calculate a route through canyon country in November. I cannot get Grover to do anything without your particular way of not saying things directly until he decides it's his own idea. She looked at him steadily. We are not the same kind of useful. That's not a hierarchy. It's a division. Clay looked at her across the kitchen table with the lamp between them and the map on the wall behind her and thought that this was probably the most honest conversation about a marriage he had ever heard, including this one, including right now. All right, he said. All right, she agreed. Good. A year after that, Evelyn was asked to speak at a county cooperative meeting, asked formally, by name, her name first on the written invitation. And she spoke for 40 minutes about water management and grazing systems and the documentation protocols that the Mercer Cooperative had developed and that had by now been adopted in modified forms by operations across 3 counties. Clay sat in the back of the room, which was full in a way county meetings in Clearwater had not previously been full, and he watched people listen to his wife the way people listened to someone who had been right enough times that they'd stopped needing to be convinced. A young woman sat near the front, a rancher's daughter of maybe 22, with a notebook open on her knee that she'd been writing in since Evelyn started speaking. After the formal portion, she approached Evelyn with the particular focused courage of someone who has something specific to ask and is going to ask it. What did you know that other people didn't, she said, when you came to Clearwater? What did you see that they missed? Evelyn looked at her for a moment, looked at her with the attention she brought to actual questions, as distinct from performative ones. I didn't know more, she said. I just didn't assume. Most people come to a problem having already decided what the answer is, and they're looking for the facts that confirm it. I looked for the facts first and let the answer come from them. She paused. I looked at the water table because I wanted to know where the water was, not because I expected it to be somewhere specific. I went through the canyon because the survey said it was there, not because I was certain it would work. The difference between assuming and looking is very small in practice. The difference in outcomes over time is very large. The young woman wrote that down. Evelyn noticed and didn't remark on it, which was its own form of respect. On the drive home in the early dark, Clay said, That's the first time I've heard you put it that way. I've been thinking it for 3 years, Evelyn said. She asked the right question. She reminded you of yourself. Evelyn was quiet for a moment, watching the road. She reminded me of what I needed when I was 22, she said, which is different, but close enough. They drove through the dark and the comfortable silence that 2 people developed when they had spent enough time together that silence didn't need to be filled. The Texas sky overhead was full of stars, sharp and close, the way they were on clear October nights. And the land on both sides of the road was land that had come back. Grass on it, water under it, animals moving through it according to a system that had been built from the ground up by 2 people who had every reason not to trust each other and had chosen to anyway. Not because it was easy, it was not easy. Not because it was romantic, though it had become something neither of them had language for and that lived in the daily small exchanges. The coffee on the table before the other person asked, the salve tin that appeared when there was a scratch, the particular way 2 people learned to share a house and then a life without erasing what made them separate. It had become something real. That was all. Real was enough. The ranch came into view as they rounded the last curve, lights on in the bunkhouse, the lamp in the kitchen window, the addition with the slightly unlevel window visible even in the dark, if you knew where to look. Clay had stopped being bothered by the window. He thought about his father, who had worked this land for 31 years and died owing a manageable debt, and had never once asked what was under the north section's dark soil or why the canyon break on the old survey showed an outflow. Not a failure of intelligence, a failure of attention, the particular failure of a man who knew what he was doing and therefore stopped asking whether he might know it differently. Clay loved his father. He also understood now what it had cost. He did not intend to make the same mistake. Evelyn was already thinking about something. He could tell by the quality of her silence, which had a different texture when she was working through a problem versus when she was simply quiet. He had learned to tell the difference. "What are you thinking about?" he said. "The east section drainage," she said. "If we put in a secondary channel before spring, we could redirect runoff from the Gerhardt Rise into the lower pasture. Better distribution." "How much would that run?" "Vasquez could do most of it, maybe $60 in materials." "We have $60, Clay said. "I know we have $60, she said. "I know exactly what we have." He believed her. He had believed her, he realized, for some time now. Not as a decision, but as the natural outcome of watching someone be right consistently in the ways that mattered. Trust built the same way water built a channel, without announcement, in the direction things actually moved over time. He pulled the wagon into the yard and they climbed down and the horses went to the trough, and the night was cool and clear overhead, and the ranch was quiet the way a working place was quiet after a long day. Not empty, just resting. "Clay," Evelyn said. He looked at her across the yard. "We did something here," she said. It was not a boast. It was the flat statement of someone examining what was in front of them with the same accuracy they brought to water tables and survey maps. "Yeah," he said. "We did." She nodded once, then went inside. He stood in the yard for a moment longer. The Mercer Ranch, bigger now, fuller, with 9 people's worth of work in it, and the next season already being planned at the kitchen table by a woman who had arrived in this county with 2 trunks and a crate of books, and her own set of cookware, and the particular refusal to be what other people decided she was. He thought about Dodd, briefly, the way you thought about weather that had passed and moved on and wasn't coming back. Dodd had been wrong about Evelyn, and wrong about Clay, and wrong about what happened when you gave 2 people no options but to pay attention. That was the whole of it. The stars overhead were very clear. The creek on the eastern edge was running, which it had been doing since February, which he did not take for granted because it was not guaranteed and because the things that were not guaranteed were the things worth watching. He went inside. Evelyn was already at the table with the lamp turned up and a new page open in the notebook, planning the east section drainage, which would not be the last problem she planned for or the last solution she found, because that was not how it worked. The problems kept coming, and the plans kept getting made, and the notebook filled up and got replaced, and the map on the wall got updated, and the land kept getting worked. That was not a story with a clean ending. It was a life. Those were different, and the difference was the point. He poured 2 cups of coffee and set one at her elbow without interrupting, and sat down at his end of the table. And it was late, and they were both tired, and the ranch was theirs, and they were going to be at this table again tomorrow and the day after that. And that was not a small thing. That was, in fact, everything.